Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in today's video we are going to do another level up video where we will learn how to allocate your damage and your damage cooldowns to help take down bosses a little bit more efficiently. I had the idea for this video because some people were asking me these questions about using their cooldowns on bosses like Echo of Neltharion, and pretty quickly I discovered when asking what they were currently doing that there were some big kind of fundamental flaws in how they were assigning their bloodlust relative to their 2 minutes and their 3 minutes and stuff based on the way that the fight worked. And so I figured this would be a good time to bust out. I've got Echo of Neltharion, Scale Commander Sarkareth, a couple other bosses as well from different parts of the game that we will take a look at in this video, and we'll go through and we'll talk about what are the characteristics that can tell you where you should start with your cooldowns and how you might reassign them during progression and during farm as timings change. So it should be a pretty good one. But first, today's video is brought to you by Guild Wars 2. Now, I've been a fan of Guild Wars, actually going back to Guild Wars 1, but Guild Wars 2 is really cool, and it does a lot of stuff differently than a lot of other MMOs. It's a pretty story-driven game at first, where you start off and you follow your character's story, and based on the choices you make, even from the very start of the game, those will continue forward as you're kind of leveling up. There's 9 different professions, and as you're leveling up, you're kind of choosing different specs in them, different specializations, and improving in those. Then once you hit level 80 and you start finishing off the first story of the first expansion, you can start picking like elite specializations that really change how your character plays. And then from there, the game just kind of opens up and you can do anything you want. There's all sorts of different horizontal progression systems in the game that you can go and pursue. You can chase down some dungeon content with scaling dungeons and fractal dungeons. There's raids, there's all kinds of stuff, or you can just go through the game's now 10-year history of story content that is in the game. And there is a new expansion coming soon called Secrets of the Obscure. That's releasing on August 22nd, and you can click the link in the description to pre-purchase now and also get some exclusive rewards, such as an Arcane Spellweaver's hat skin, an Eagle Eye weapon of your choice, and the Demon Hunter title at a max level boost. Thanks to Guild Wars 2 to sponsoring this video. Now back to it. All right, so let's start off with Echo of Neltharion, which is the one that spawned this video. And you'll see here I've got a pretty scientific way of describing how the fight works. So Phase 1 lasts from 100 to 60% health, and it'll eventually kill you if you stay in Phase 1 for too long. Once you get over that like 2 minute and 40 second mark, the boss is going to cast another Volcanic Fissure and is going to kill you, so that is very bad. Actually, it's a set of Volcanic Hearts even that will kill you first. Then Phase 2 lasts from whenever it pushes into Phase 2. It's actually time-based how long you can survive in Phase 2, with either a set of Volcanic Hearts or an Umbral Annihilation spam at the end that are going to determine that. You can damage the boss during this phase, but once you get to 35%, the boss goes immune until you kill the third ad and start the last phase. And then the final phase is just a straight-up burn, although there are portals that you step into to survive the fight that will cause you to do no damage while you're inside them, or do 1% damage or something. So optimizing your damage around those is also a relevant thing. Now, this video is going to be somewhat abstract, but also we're gonna try and use the real-world examples here. I'm not going to look at specific exact timestamps, although this is, I guess, one of those. But this is going to be the only exact timestamp in here that'll be illustrative, and then from then on, we'll mostly speak in terms of like whether you can or can't fit extra 2 minutes or 3 minutes into things. So let me just go through kind of the basic steps of how you should assign your cooldowns on any fight ever, any raid fight ever, any boss fight ever. Step 1 is, when does relevant damage to the boss start? Now, on a fight like Echo of Neltharion, there is a burn from 35 to 0 that is Phase 3, and if you can get the boss to 35% in Phases 1 and 2, any additional boss damage in those phases is useless. So early on in progression, that's not always going to be the case, right? You're not always going to be able to get the boss to 35%, but this is pretty common. There's a lot of bosses like this where there is a percent health breakpoint that you reach, and because you've reached that breakpoint, any additional damage earlier in the fight is wasted. And that's true here. Notice that that's true in Phase 1 and Phase 2, right? If we get Phase 1 done faster, it actually doesn't even give us more time in Phase 2, because Phase 2 just is time-based in terms of how long we can survive in there. And we get there on a health percent breakpoint. So in theory, for early progression, you want to milk as long as you can in phase 1, right? Survive there for as long as possible, save as many damage cooldowns as possible. And then even in phase 2, you want to be careful to not use any cooldowns such that you will lose a use in P3, which is the main burn of the fight. Now, P3 lasts from 35 to 0, and it lasts a couple of minutes, and this is a spot where you're going to want to consider the second characteristic that you always want to be thinking about, which is multiplying as many of your cooldowns as possible together with Bloodlust. And this is a huge thing. There was somebody came into my chat and was asking me about their Echo of Neltharion timings, and it turns out they were using Bloodlust at a different spot than they were using 2 minutes, at a different spot than they were using 3 minutes in the last phase. Now, sometimes there can be cases where you're going to want to separate out your Bloodlust from other effects, especially in Mythic Plus sometimes. It's like, oh, we just need enough to kill this ad, and then enough to kill this ad, and you want to just make sure you have something for everyone. But Echo of Neltharion is not like that. Echo of Neltharion is primarily a boss damage burn. Obviously, you want to kill the ads in P3 if you can, especially early on. But a lot of guilds will kill that fight with the last set of ads just being kited around and killing the boss. And any boss damage you do ends the fight sooner. So you want to make sure that Lust is multiplying the power of as many cooldowns as possible, which means ideally you're going to want to make sure that 2 minutes and 3 minutes can be lined up for Lust. So when you see a fight like this, the instinct that most top players are going to have here is we're going to be thinking about holding cooldowns as much as possible through P1 and P2 to make sure they are available in P3 for the Lust. And there's actually several different times you can Lust P3. You can Lust right at the start of P3, you can Lust right after you come out from the first portals, or you can Lust right after you come out from the second portals. Any of those options will give you a nice long window where you can have all of your 2 minutes and all of your 3 minutes be fully effective, not doing 0 damage because you're in one of the portals. And you can make sure that they multiply with a Bloodlust effectively as well. So that is the main consideration. So whichever of those is going to happen will be informed by when 2 and 3 minutes are going to be available. Now we see that phase 1 lasts up to 2 minutes 40 seconds. So that means if you use your 2 minutes on pull, right, and then you use them again towards the end of P1, when are you going to use them next? Well, you could use them in the middle of P2, and now you're going to get them, so you use them at 0, 2, 4, and then you're going to get them at 6, and that's like somewhere typically towards the end-ish of the fight. That is rough for the purposes of lining it up with your other cooldowns generally, although often that sort of timing works out elegantly if it's a fight without these sort of damage stop incentives, because what you can do with your 3 minutes is you can use them at 1, 3, and 6, right? 1, 3, and 6, 0, 3, and 6, and 0, 2, 4, 6 is a natural way for your 2 minutes and 3 minutes to line up with each other, and that gives you an option to then hit your Lust at the 6 minute mark. That's pretty rare to see in fights, though, because usually if you don't have to hold your cooldowns at all, you can just hit your Lust at 0 instead. And that's the kind of default answer, right? It's just Lust on pull, let's end all of our cooldowns here. However, on Echo of Neltharion, we just talked about it, you're going to stop damage at 35% because you don't need it, right? The boss is gonna stop taking damage at 35%. So any extra damage you did in here is not important unless it actually got you to that 35%, right? Unless you wouldn't have gotten to 35% without that damage. So because of that, we can actually sit on a use of our 3 minutes and our 2 minutes even, and we can just sit on both of these, and we can have them both up at the start of P3. And if we do that, we can Lust at the start of P3. That's what my guild does now on farm. Or we can Lust after the first portals for even more uptime on all of those cooldowns, and lining them up with some like 90-second stuff as well that some specs are using, because you do want to, of course, sometimes you want to use, you might want to use your first 2 minutes right at the start of P2 and cut them out of P1 entirely, right? So you can use 2 minutes and then 2 minutes again here, and then you 2 minutes right at the start of P3, or right after you come out of the first portals, and you line those up with your Lust and with all your cooldowns, and that's like everything. Oh, emptying the bag right there. And that, I think, is the best progression strategy for this boss, is 3 minutes and 2 minutes on pull, no Lust. And then on phase 2, you can 2 minute the first ad, And you can spread out a couple of cooldowns for some of the later ads as well if you need it to push those ads. But if you're reaching 35% on the boss, don't over allocate, save everything, and then in P3, come out of those first portals, hit the lust, kill the boss, and you can do a huge amount of damage to the boss with that lust. Or you can even hit the lust at the start of P3 if you want, if you have enough of your cooldowns up, and just, it's a little bit lazier, but it's a little bit, that's what my guild does during farm, but I think it's a little bit worse for prog generally. So that's Echo of Neltharion. Let's talk about Scale Commander Sarkareth, because this is a fight that I think a lot of people... It's actually interesting because it's different on Heroic versus Mythic as well. So this is a fight that, in the style of Jailer, has 2 triggers that let you push between phases. You can either push with % damage or with time. If you wait 1 minute and 40 seconds into P1, P2 is starting, whether you're ready for it or not. And if you push the boss to 60%, the boss is just going to stop doing what it's doing. And I think it's actually a little bit above 60 and 40%, but these are just, again, illustrative. Then the boss is just going to go up and start P2 again, even if you weren't ready for it. So, what do we do with our lust in a fight like this? Let's start by considering the Mythic version of this fight. On Mythic, you are never actually going to hit the % threshold. Not never actually, but on Progression Mythic, you're never going to hit these % thresholds, right? They may as well not exist, and you may as well be thinking of this fight as only based on time pushing. And for that reason, unlike Echo of Neltharion, damage is actually relevant on Scale Commander Sarkareth for the entire fight, right? The whole fight, Scale Commander Sarkareth is taking good damage. So for that reason, this is a great candidate for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and Lust to all be sent on pull. Because this is a spot in the fight where they're all available, and if you press them all now, you're definitely not going to lose any uses of them later because they'll all come up as soon as possible from here. So this is it's a great opportunity. This is a great example of a fight where it makes so much sense to hit the Lust on pull. Now, there are some reasons that it's also good to Lust on pull, namely P1 is the most intense healer part of this fight, and Lust helps your healers as well. But also, in P2 and P3, you have players going down and coming back up. Now, they are coming back up with a buff. If you have a damage buff, it generally makes sense to multiply that with Lust as well. But it's a haste buff, and Lust is also haste. So there's actually some diminishing returns with lusting with a haste buff, especially with a haste buff of the magnitude you can get on Sarkareth. So that ends up being a little bit less important. And the main thing is there's random people going down to do bomb jobs, whereas the start of the fight, you have everybody available to hit the boss for full value and with their full damage all at the same time. So that's another important feature of Lust, right? That's something we're always looking for, is line up Lust with 2 minutes and 3 minutes when everybody can be hitting the boss as well. Now, how does this change on Heroic difficulty? And this, I actually think, is... If you're in either a Heroic Progression guild or a pug, oftentimes you're going to find that this boss, the damage check isn't too bad, but the hard part of this fight is the initial P3 mechanic spam that it does right around here, right? Where the boss is just casting like 40 abilities at you, and it's a lot to deal with. The other thing you'll notice in Heroic is often you actually hit the % pushes instead of the time pushes. Often not the P1% push, but the P2% push is very realistic to hit if your DPS is quite good in a Heroic situation. Now, obviously, if you're in a Heroic Progression guild, that's probably not going to happen. But if you're in a moderately strong Heroic Pug, for instance, often you're going to be able to hit these % pushes. So what do we do with Lust in this situation? Well, if you're overpowering the boss by a huge enough magnitude that you know you're going to one-shot the boss, just send the Lust on pull, right? Like, that's fine. Just do that. That's totally fine. But if you're not doing that, the fact that you're hitting this 40% mark means that, again, all damage up to this point doesn't matter, and you can give up some of that for more damage after this point where the damage does matter, right? So holding your Lust in that situation makes a lot of sense if you're in a situation like Heroic Sarkareth, and especially if you are having no trouble with P1 and P2 damage and a lot of trouble with P3 damage and mechanics. Hold your Lust for that phase and hit it right at the start of that phase or right after the first set of mechanic spam is done, something like that, and you'll find an extra amount of value there. Now, one argument you could make is, well, P1 Lust is still good because we're hitting the time threshold on P1, but note that if you're hitting the % threshold in P2, it actually doesn't matter whether you're hitting the percent or time threshold in P1. Either way, that P1 damage is irrelevant. If you are ever hitting a percent push instead of a time push, all previous damage throughout the whole fight, unless you were like skipping an overlap that was going to kill you, is irrelevant and shouldn't be thought of as being important damage. All the important damage instead is after whatever percent phase push you've met. Okay, next one here. This one's a little bit of a curveball. Harlan Sweete in Freehold. So this is also a 3-phase boss. It's a dungeon boss, so a little bit different. But notably, there's a double damage taken in P3, and also P2 and P3 both feature increased mechanics and group damage, and P3 actually features increased tank damage as well, which most tanks are pretty resilient to, but is worth noting. So, couple of factors here. Number one, P1 is the easy bit. So maybe in a dungeon situation, you're going to want to not use too many cooldowns in P1. If you're only going to get, say, one use of a 3-minute in this fight, you might not want to send it in P1 because you might prefer to have a longer P1 and a shorter P2 and P3 where you're in more danger. That's, you know, it's pretty niche that you'll actually end up in this in a situation where you might want to care about that. But in theory, that would make sense if you were progressing this at a very, very high level. Although, you know, if you're progressing it at a very, very high level due to the way that M+ works, the timer is super important as well. So you're mostly just thinking about lining up your cooldowns efficiently with your lust and stuff. And the lust on pull with this boss with all cooldowns can make a lot of sense. But one thing that I see people, and the reason that this is on this list, is I see people holding their cooldowns for P3 on this fight because it takes double damage in P3. This is actually not an efficiency increase. It is valuable for padding to make your damage look bigger on details, but damage that gets you to P3 faster is equally good as damage that is done in P3 when you're taking double damage, right? Getting to the double damage faster is equally valuable as doing the damage in the double damage spot with your cooldowns, which you might think of as weird because it's a percent-based push, like the above percent-based phases. And, you know, if this was a raid boss, it would maybe be a little bit different because you'd be having 50 wipes in P3 because that was the hard part. But in M+, we're not assuming there's a hot... You're not really doing, like, the progression, reducing the risk of failure, having a DPS check that starts at the start of P3, right? That's, like, a big feature of many raid bosses is there's an enrage that you're facing that often starts either at the beginning of the fight or the beginning of P3. And for that reason, the damage in P3 is super relevant. In M+, that's not the case, right? You can take 5 minutes on this boss, you can take 3 minutes, you can take 10, it doesn't enrage. It doesn't do any of that to you. So you're just looking for potentially making the fight easier, which potentially means holding stuff in P1 and making P2, P3 shorter. But P3 itself is actually not a... It's not a damage... It is not an efficiency gain to save your cooldowns for P3, right? If you imagine your whole group saved cooldowns for P3, you just get there a lot later, and it doesn't actually speed up your kill time there. One caveat to this is that there is technically one bit of efficiency you can do on this fight, which is the boss does do like a 1-second loaded dice cast at 30% to enter into P3. That is a very inefficient time to do damage to the boss because you've already made it to the 30% push, but the boss isn't yet taking double damage, and the boss is going to push. Unlike the rest of P1 and P2, the boss is going to push regardless of whether you do any damage to it during that phase. So, in theory, it would be optimal to have globals like Stormkeeper, where you're kind of pushing a button that doesn't do upfront damage, but sets you up to do more damage later. In theory, it's optimal to put those in that 1-second cast during the boss's push at 30%. It's not, again, nobody has ever thought about this boss. Nobody has ever actually done this in a relevant key in Freehold, I don't think. But I think it's an interesting example, and especially in the context of what if they made a raid boss like this that required that kind of level of hyper optimization. What are the incentives that it is offering you and that it is paying you with? Okay, next boss is Raszageth the Storm Eater. Now this boss has 5 phases, which many would say is too many, and, interestingly, lasts long enough on progression that you can get 2 Bloodlusts on this fight. This 14-minute fight or something on prog, so you can actually land a lust on pull and a lust in P3. But what I want to do here is I just want to talk about the way that the pushes incentivize your cooldown timing. Because P1 push is a percent push, but on progression, it's P1 is also on a timer before it's going to wipe you. So you are trying to push out before you get the next Hurricane Wing that's going to kill you, right? And so having all your cooldowns in P1 is vitally important to escape out of P1 before you're dead. Even though it's a percent health, not a time-based push, it's still very important to use your cooldowns there because you have to or you're going to die. And that's above all the other rules I was talking about. If you got to send your cooldowns to not die, that's the most important thing to do. And that's how P1 works, right? Is you got to send all your cooldowns, especially early in progression on this fight. You would just send everything as it came up, trying to get to 65% before Raszageth killed you so that you could see more of the fight. Now, even during progression, as we got better at this fight, we started holding stuff at the end of P1 because we had optimized our damage more, we were more comfortable with the fight, our gear was better, all of these things were true, and so we started being much more comfortable pushing out of P1, saving our seconds out of 2 minutes, right? Instead of doing 2 minutes on pull and at the end of P1, we would just do 2 minutes on pull, and we would save the ones at the end of P1 to use at the start of the first intermission instead, and we'd still make the 65% push in time. And that is always a feature of a boss that has a percent health push, is that as you get better, both during progression and during farm, you're going to want to take cooldowns off of that phase rather than push early, because pushing early isn't going to do anything for you, but taking cooldowns off of that phase is going to do something for you, namely make intermission 1 a lot easier. Now, intermission 1 is pretty scripted. There's not much you can do to speed. It's pretty pass-fail, right? You either do it or you don't, and whether you do it quick or slow, you don't really, it doesn't change much. You can maybe hit Raszageth for a couple of globals at the start of P2 if you get there early, but it doesn't really matter. But the interesting thing about this fight is that as soon as P2 starts, all boss damage is relevant because the P2 to intermission 2 push is timer-based, not percent health-based. I think, again, like Scale Commander Sarkareth, there's technically like a 25%, you know, if I get to this point in P2, I'm just insta-pushing. But in practice, especially on Mythic difficulty, that's not something you're ever going to see during progression or during the tier. So you can effectively think of it as all damage being relevant from the start of P2. So you're going to want to make sure you get the total number, the maximum total number of 2 minutes and 3 minutes that are possible into the combined P2 and P3 window. And that's going to include a lust if possible, and that lust is going to multiply with as many of your cooldowns as possible. Now, helpfully, Raszageth gives us intermission 2, where we can just avoid using any cooldowns, right? And because of that, then we can lust with 2 minutes and 3 minutes, all at the start of P3, and we can just use our 2 minutes, you know, maybe once or maybe twice during P2 even. I don't remember how long that phase was, and you don't need to use them during the second intermission, and we can use our 3 minutes at some point during... you know, during the intermission, or during the phase, during the first intermission, and again with our lust at the start of P3. And again, this lets us get the maximum total number of uses in during this phase. Another thing that people misunderstand about phase 2 is that the boss shields itself and gives you increased damage done. Now, like Harlan Sweete, people think, oh, double damage, I should save my cooldowns for this. That's actually not true with Raszageth either. With Raszageth, you needed to make sure you had enough damage to break the shields, yes, because if you didn't do that, and if you didn't break them in a timely fashion, you would die. So again, back to rule 1, which is make sure you have enough damage to skip whatever's going to kill you. But aside from that, breaking through the shield more quickly or more slowly doesn't help. It's a reverse situation of the Harlan Sweete case, right? It's like if Harlan Sweete had his P3 at the start rather than the end of the fight, where it doesn't matter, or in the middle rather than at the end of the fight, it doesn't matter how much you do during this phase, because there's only a certain flat number of damage to the boss that can be done with the increased damage done amp, right? The fact that the increased damage done, it doesn't last for 10 seconds, it lasts for however many seconds the shield lives for, right? It lasts for however much damage the shield has on it, which is a flat number. That's, you know, that 59 million or whatever, that's as much damage as you're going to do double damage for. So it doesn't matter whether that's with your cooldowns or not, because either way, it's the same number. It's not something where there are damage amps on some fights where a boss like gets stunned and is taking double damage for 20 seconds flat instead of for 59 million damage. If it says, I'm taking double damage for 20 seconds, that should be in your head, this is a cooldown moment, right? If a boss is taking double damage for 20 seconds, I want to do everything I can to line up my cooldowns and ideally lust with this. But if the boss is taking double damage for 59 million damage, that actually doesn't matter at all. It doesn't help. to do any extra damage to those. So you'll send your cooldowns on the shields for safety in some cases, right? To break through the shield before your healers run out of healing. But it doesn't help you do the boss any faster, whether you use it during or right after those shields in P2 or before. Any of that's the same. The thing that will speed up the boss is maximizing your total number of cooldowns from when damage becomes relevant, which in Raszageth is right here, right at the start of P2, and making sure that you multiply them with each other whenever possible. You don't actually need to multiply your 2 minutes and your 3 minutes with each other, but you need to make sure that Lust multiplies with as many cooldowns as possible, right? That is the core of Lust, is that it goes in a spot where as many players in your raid can hit their cooldowns as possible, and they can do it without being affected by too many mechanics, right? So nice windows for that. And part of the reason why when bosses get stunned and take extra damage, it's so good to Lust there, is that they often put no mechanics on bosses like that. But this isn't, they haven't had too many bosses like that this expansion, where the boss has like an increased damage taken phase. Some examples from previous expansions would be like N'Zoth, the stuns in P1 or whatever, whenever you'd kill a Psychus and you could hit N'Zoth for like 15 or 20 seconds, like that. That sort of big dam onto boss can be really nice. Or, yeah, what are some other ones? What are some good examples of a boss that actually gets stunned and takes extra damage that... Oh, I guess Sludgefist. Sludgefist is like an ideal example of this, where the boss charges into a wall and then does nothing for a while, right? 12 second, 100% increased damage taken. So I should have put Sludgefist on this list because Sludgefist was sweet, right? Sludgefist was this fight that actually, let's see if I can we can just do I can expand the canvas. Look at the tech here, Paint 3D. Okay, so Sludgefist, right? Sludgefist bonus extra fight. Okay, I've gone and looked at the kill videos from Sludgefist, and I've found the times of the double damage moments. So the first one is at 50 seconds, the next one's at 204, then 313, 423, and 530. Subject to change a little bit depending on how long he's charging for. And at 530, it's just double damage for a while, and then at the end of that double damage, you're like dead if you haven't killed it already, or you're limping over the finish line with like 2 tanks left alive as they struggle to kill the end of the boss. So, how do we optimize our damage on a fight like Sludgefist? Well, the first thing you'll note is that the first break here is at 50 seconds. So what happens if we use our Lust and all of our cooldowns on this one, right? Let's just think about this as our first hypothetical, is the boss is getting stunned and taking extra damage. Let's use our Lust and our CDs here, right? So we can put 2 minutes. Let's see. I've been using some consistent colors for these, so we'll do 2 minutes and 3 minutes and Lust here, right? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and Lust here. Okay, that's pretty good. What does this mean for the rest of the fight? Well, our 2 minutes are going to be back up for this one, and then they'll be back up, I guess, for this burn at the end, but that's kind of sketchy. This is kind of a sketchy spot to use 2 minutes again because people are going to start dying basically as soon as the double damage is happening here. It is very, very... You got a couple of globals on a lot of people, so I wouldn't count that for very much. And the 3 minutes will come back up again here at 4:23. So that's, that's something, right? That's sort of okay. We are getting 2 good uses of 2 minutes in a stun, plus 2 good uses of 3 minutes in stuns, plus we're multiplying our Lust with all of our cooldowns. So that's sort of compelling. But there is a better way to do this, which comes from the process of let's not miss a use, and the way to always think about how to not miss uses of stuff is to always start from the perspective of using everything on pull, and using stuff on cooldown, or roughly on cooldown. But we can do better. And the way to actually do better on this fight, I don't know if there's like a easy set of rules that you can come by here. This is something you just kind of have to think through all the possibilities. But your objectives on this fight are, I want the maximum total number of 2 minutes in these stuns, right? So we can look through that and we can see, all right, we can get 2 of those, and let's not count the one at 5:30 because the boss is, it's kind of it dies or we die at this point. So let's say we can get 2 minutes in stuns, right? 2 in stuns, and we can get, how many 3 minutes can we get in stuns? We get 2 of those in stuns as well, right? 2, 3 in stun. Okay, and then what do we want to do with our Lust? Lust is in a stun. Lust with both in stun. Now I'm left-handed and I'm doing this with my right hand. I use a mouse and keyboard right-handed. That's a P, not an N. Okay, there we go. In stun. There we go. I did it. Now you can't blame my handwriting too much here because again, I'm left-handed. I use my mouse right-handed, so this is not, my handwriting is not, it's not this bad. But so how do we do better against this? How do we do better against this with these priorities in mind? Well, you'll notice that we're not getting, if we don't count this 2-minute here, which you couldn't actually get much value out of this 2-minute here, you'll notice that over the course of this fight, which there's effective damage available for like 5 minutes, we're only getting 2 minutes in here. So what we want to do is we want to be able to hit our 2-minute on pull as well. Because if we can hit our 2-minute on pull, then we can actually fit 3 2-minutes in here, rather than getting that scuffed one at the end of the fight we can get ones in better spots in the fight. So we can use our 2 minutes on pull. We can jumpstart our rotations with those for the classes that benefit from that. And then we can send again at 2:04 and again at 4:23. Now, where are we going to hit Lust here and have it go with our 3 minutes as well? Well, this is sort of a starting it from the end of the fight rather than the start of the fight theory. We can hit our Lust with our 3 minutes here. And what does this do with our 3 minutes? Well, it means our 3 minutes will be up at 1:23 or sooner. So we can put our 3 minutes on this first stun, and you'll notice we've actually achieved all of our objectives here, except we've done it even a little bit better. And there's a few reasons that this tends to be a little bit better than this. And that is we've got Lust in a harder part to heal. The boss is doing more damage at the end of the fight than the start of the fight, so slight benefit for healers. But also, we are getting a good use of 2 minutes at the start of the fight, rather than a scuffed use of 2 minutes at the end of the fight, where there is a stun, sort of, but there's also dead players, right? If you're trying to use your 2 minutes there, you're dead. Now, you could just adapt this cooldown timing and put this 2 minute right here instead, and just have them press it and have it sort of bleed into the very start of this stun. That's another potential option for handling this. But I tend to think that, especially with the way that the Lust helps your healers out at the end here, that this is the best way to assign your cooldowns on a fight like Sludgefist. But it requires you to basically do that whole thought process of what's the maximum number of all of these cooldowns that I can get, and what's the way I can use Lust most efficiently. And most importantly, I'm not just thinking of the maximum total number of uses given the fight length, but I want to make sure that I'm landing my damage in the damage amp phases. And the reason that this is different than Raszageth, again, is that this is a stun for a duration, whereas Raszageth was a shield for an amount of health. And that is just night and day difference. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it's that some fights can look very similar to each other superficially, but it really matters whether a push is based on a boss's percent or whether it like locks the boss's percent at that push, right? Whether a push is based on time or a percent. Whether a shield or a damage amp is based on time or damage. Those change your incentives basically to the opposite of each other, and you need to be able to identify that during progression so that you can know, and this matters not only for how you're allocating your cooldowns, but for how you're playing as a player, whether you are prioritizing that damage or whether you are prioritizing instead survivability, mechanics, those sorts of things to a higher degree than if the damage was relevant. Because obviously, the best players, we always want to be doing damage and mechanics to the fullest extent possible. But in the real world, there are sometimes trade-offs that you have to make between those different goals. And understanding whether damage you're dealing to the boss is extra important, normal important, or unimportant can really help you make a good decision about whether you should go do that mechanic, whether you should, leave that to one of the healers, or whether you should just, risk it and soak, stand in some avoidable damage to do extra damage, which, on Mythic, often they make the avoidable damage just kill you, but sometimes that's right. Even on Mythic, sometimes that can be a vibe. So that was this video. I hope it helped. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.